Hello and welcome to the review for the final exam. And in this brief recording, I'm going to take you through the question on the final exam. I'm going to tell you how it's going to work, what the format's going to be, and how to prepare yourself for answering the question. So the final exam is going to be focused on the final part of our course, where we've looked at the philosophy of tragedy. And it's going to involve thinking about the two plays that we've looked at, Oedipo Alcalde, a version of Oedipus the King, and Macbeth was the other play, the Shakespearean play that we looked at as well. So it's going to involve constructing a theory using the theories that we've talked about to explain how these two plays work as tragedy. All right, so the final exam will be a 2-hour timed exam, and you'll have to complete it in one sitting. So you'll set 2 hours aside and you'll complete the exam on Blackboard. There'll be a link in assignments that says final exam, and you'll click on the folder, and when you're ready, you'll enter the final exam when you have a 2-hour window that is free. The exam will consist of a single essay question. And the question will ask you to explain the philosophical importance of tragedy. Your task is to explain how Macbeth and Oedipus the King work as tragedy using the theoretical frameworks we have discussed. All right? And we've discussed two theoretical frameworks in particular. We talked about Aristotle's theory of tragedy, the role of the emotions, hamartia, catharsis, all of that stuff. And we talked about the Schopenhauer Nietzsche view of tragedy, the sublime, the sort of Nietzsche's Dionysian versus Apollonian opposition. So we talked about these frameworks and we use them to sort of think about how tragedy works. So your task is to use the theoretical background that we've talked about, that we've sort of outlined and discussed, to explain how Macbeth and Oedipus work as tragedy, right? So effectively, you're applying the theories to the plays, forming connections, and in the process, you're developing your theory, your understanding of how tragedy works, the mechanisms it uses, and how it sort of constructs, how it sort of works as a process and what effect it has on the audience. So we want to explain all that using Aristotle or Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. All right, so the question will ask you to provide an interpretation of both plays. So you'll have to work on an interpretation or an understanding of Oedipus the King, Oedipo Alcalde, and an interpretation of Macbeth. Now, to interpret the plays, to understand them, you may use the ideas of Aristotle or Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, or you may use a combination of both theories. If you think it makes more sense to talk about them both together, you're welcome to do that, or to use ideas from both to explain. That's fine. It may be that you want to say that Aristotle's interpretation works better for Oedipus, maybe the Schopenhauer-Nietzsche interpretation works better for Macbeth, or maybe it's the other way around, maybe Schopenhauer-Nietzsche works better for Oedipus, Aristotle works better for Macbeth. But that's something that's a decision you have to think about when you think about what works for your interpretation. So think about what you want to focus on. And the sort of interpretation you want to develop. But remember, you have to talk about both plays, but it's up to you which theories you use. You could use Aristotle for both. You can use Nietzsche and Schopenhauer to sort of make sense of both, or you can use a combination or a mix of the two, however you want to do it. Okay, so in course materials, you'll see the exam review sheet is now available, and this is the review sheet that I'm going to use to sort of give you guidance and help you see, help you figure out what's important and the sort of things to look for in the readings, the theories, and the plays that we've talked about. And so what I'm doing in the review sheet is I'm breaking down the major theories and talking about how those theories work as tragedy. Right. So in Aristotle, we talked about sort of the cognitive view and the sort of meta-ethical view, and Aristotle's sort of definition of a tragedy here. And the most important point, as we saw when Aristotle talks about this idea of arousing pity and fear, incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish purgation or catharsis of such emotions. So this idea of pity and fear and then purgation is a really important part of Aristotle's theory. So if you're going to talk about Aristotle, make sure you have an understanding of how that works. We talked about the idea of mimesis, recognition, the sort of recognition and reversal. Remember, the reversal is the reversal of fortune of the tragic hero. Recognition is their sort of recognition of their fate. Hamartia is a really important concept for Aristotle. And remember, the tragic hero suffers not because of a moral failing or flaw, but because, and this is the meaning of hamartia, because of a kind of mistake or error, right? So that's what makes, that's what sort of constitutes hamartia. And we talked about that, remember, in terms of it's almost like an excess of virtue. It's like intellectual arrogance or extreme ambition, right? Ordinarily, those things are sort of things that we value, right? We sort of value somebody who's ambitious. We sort of value intellect and people who have a strong intellect. But in certain circumstances, those virtues can become flaws. They can arrogance, intellectual knowledge can become arrogance, and ambition can become sort of betrayal. It can sort of go too far and get very extreme. So we talked about that idea of hamartia and how it allows us to understand the tragic hero as somebody who is not morally guilty, but has some kind of failing or flaw. All right, and we talked about the sort of Plato's arguments that Aristotle is responding to. The painting argument, remember, relies on the idea that the forms are the only things that are real. And painters only capture external appearances. And then we talked about the stiff upper lip argument, about the way tragedy undermines our capacity to reason. So Aristotle challenges those arguments and wants to say that tragedy performs important emotional, social, and intellectual functions, right? And we talked about that in terms of bringing our emotions into balance. We talked about that in terms of the sort of knowledge that tragedy brings with it, of our mortality, of our sort of the reality of death that we constantly try to push away. So tragedy is bringing us sort of an intellectual and emotional realignment, and that's really a core part of Aristotle's theory. So there's a lot of points here to think about, a lot of points to develop and to go over if you want to focus on Aristotle's theory. And of course, we also talked about Nussbaum's idea of the vulnerability of the good life, and the way this sort of sheds light on the sort of tragic character of everyday life. And we work this out by sort of figuring out this role of luck. In Nussbaum's view of Aristotle, that luck has an important relation to living well. Living well is never totally free of luck. It's never entirely within our control. And so happiness is vulnerable to what she calls uncontrolled circumstances, which might deprive it of some instrumental means or resource, illness or poverty, or block activity by depriving it of the very object or recipient of the activity. So it's those external circumstances in Oedipus outside his control that creates a gap between what he intended and involuntarily did. That's what dislodges him from eudaimonia. So Nussbaum's example fills in gives us a sort of rich picture of Aristotle's view as recognizing the role of luck in human life and recognizing how tragedy sort of recognizes this idea and allows us to reflect on our contingency and vulnerability, right? Our vulnerability to, which really literally means our injurability, the fact that we're not immune to worldly events and things affecting us and affecting our happiness. So this is another interesting piece to use in developing Aristotle's theory of tragedy. Okay, and the second theory we looked at was the Nietzsche, the view associated with Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, which we talked about as a metaphysical view, in contrast to Aristotle's view, which is about the emotions and learning and so on. And so we work this out by thinking about the idea of disinterestedness and the idea of sort of contemplating something rather than being sort of stuck in our world of desire through the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. So it's that moment of disinterestedness in art when we're able to sort of see things as they really are. And in Schopenhauer, it's in particular the experience of the sublime that gives us that moment of being present in the sort of horrors and the terrors of life, but also having that sort of awareness that we're not totally identical with that perception. That's the experience of the sublime when we feel sort of raised up by the super sensible side of our being, which is not equivalent to the world of suffering. So the main thing here, and the main difference from Aristotle, is that it offers us a redemption of from pity and fear. So catharsis becomes like more of a religious experience rather than a medical ethical experience as it is for Aristotle, right? So tragedy gives us more like the kind of Buddhist experience of release from suffering, or the premonition, the sort of the promise of release from suffering through that sort of sublime anticipation. In Nietzsche, we sort of went further into that through the opposition between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and the fact that Dionysus represents this sort of underground emotion and vitality, this sort of forces of life. And we saw in Nietzsche there's this sort of there's this naturalistic view that when we have this sublime experience, what we're identifying with is just the totality of nature. So it's like a distinction between ourselves as individuals and experiencing ourselves as individuals, exposed to and prone to suffering, and then the idea of sort of experiencing ourselves as the whole itself, right? The whole that is in movement. We're a part of that whole, like the drop of water is part of the wave. We move together with it, and in sort of identifying with the whole, we identify with the whole movement rather than with the individuals that suffer. So that's really important for Nietzsche's theory. So there's a lot to build on here, and a lot you can sort of pick up on. It's up to you to pick out what's important and build an interpretation. And remember, the most important thing in building an interpretation is showing how the tragedies work. So making those sort of connections and showing how the theories illuminate what's happening in the tragedies that we're focusing on: Oedipus the King, or Oedipo Alcalde, and Macbeth. So make sure you make connections between the details of the film and the theoretical ideas you are drawing on, right? So if you're talking about hamartia, describe how it works in the play. If you're talking about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, then talk about how that moment of the sublime arises. Talk about how you sort of sense that moment of sort of release. Where do we see that in the film? Where do we see, for example, Macbeth's famous lines, on the on the kind of on the lack of, on the sort of tragedy of life, its lack of meaning. Those are sort of moments where you can sort of build in the Schopenhauer interpretation and make that connection. So make those connections and draw connections between the ideas and the details to really make the interpretation stand out. And feel free to express your own thoughts as well on what worked and what didn't. Maybe there are parts where the play might have really brought out more strongly elements of tragedy. For example, pity and fear. Do we feel pity for Macbeth, or is it too much? Is the character seem too much? Does his misfortune seem too merited for us really to sort of grasp that idea of pity? Do we really sense that idea of unmerited misfortune? So think about think about your own ideas, your own sentiments of what worked and what didn't, and build on those, and feel free to give those expression in your interpretation. And finally, good luck. Make sure you give yourself a clear 2-hour window. Make sure you have time to devote yourself to taking the exam. Make sure as much as possible that you are in a place with a good internet connection so that you don't get disrupted. If you do get sent out, obviously you have to contact me and I will reset it for you. But give yourself the best chance, give yourself a good 2-hour window. Do preparation first. Make sure you have a close look at the review sheet. Make notes and sort of go over the plays and the readings and get yourself well prepared to take the exam. And then finally, give yourself a window and take it in that window and do your best.